something like this. The reason that Pickett's charge failed is because that Confederate artillery bombardment failed. It was not a success. A lot of the Confederate guns overshot their targets. They didn't hit this area well enough, and that's why the infantry attack must have failed. Where does that myth come from? It is in fact a lie. But where it comes from is because during this bombardment, if you can imagine, when these Union guns fire back, now there's 300 guns firing back and forth in this kind of humidity with Civil War guns. The whole valley gets filled with a really thick gray smoke. The smoke is so thick that you cannot see 25 feet in front of you. So how are you supposed to aim a gun if you can't see the target? You can't even see where your shells are hitting. So a lot of the shells on both ends begin to sail over their target. Now remember I pointed out Meade's headquarters. I told you, take a note of where that building is. The reason I pointed it out to you is because Meade's headquarters begins to suffer direct shell fire in this Confederate bombardment. Meade himself has to run out of the building and jump on his horse and ride away for fear of being killed. The Confederates aren't hitting that building on purpose. That's an accident. That's how far off some of their shots go. Which is why historians after the battle said, that bombardment must have been a failure. I mean, look how far off they were. Well, I'm going to prove to you otherwise. And to prove to you that the Confederate bombardment was not inaccurate, I want to tell you about the 4 guns that you see directly beside me. There were 6 of those guns at the time, and that's exactly where they were positioned. And the man in charge of those 6 guns was a Union 22-year-old lieutenant named Alonzo Cushing. Now, you can all take a look at me, because I am 22 years old. I'm a child. I'm a kid. And this guy, a child, for 22, has an enormous responsibility on his shoulders. The 6 guns at the center of the Union line are his responsibility. The guy just graduated college the year before, and now he's in the middle of an epic bombardment. 4 of his 6 guns suffer a direct hit from Confederate artillery fire. That means a 12-pound cannonball directly hits and crushes his gun. That's some pretty accurate Confederate artillery fire. He has 100 guns lined up where you see those cars parked today, or 100 horses, excuse me. Every single horse but one is killed in this bombardment. Cushing has 100 men crewing his 6 guns. Half of those men are casualties in the bombardment. Lieutenant Cushing himself is hit twice in the midst of this barrage. Once in the shoulder, and a very painful wound that we will not discuss to his groin. You can imagine for yourself, let's just say it was incapacitating. In the midst of the bombardment, his commanding officer comes up to him and says, "Lieutenant, you're bleeding all over the place, you're wounded. Leave and go get medical help at the rear." Cushing says no. Cushing refuses to leave the battlefield. In fact, he asks permission to do the opposite. He asks permission to take his 2 surviving guns and to wheel them up to this stone wall, to move them forward. And Cushing said, when those Confederates come across this field, I'll be here, wounded or not, and I will be waiting for them with my guns. So, when we wonder, why did the Confederate bombardment fail? It is not because of inaccuracy. Lieutenant Cushing would certainly tell you otherwise. It was because of the courage of men like Alonzo Cushing, who even when he was wounded, refused to run away from the battlefield. That is why Robert E. Lee launched this bombardment. He felt that the Union troops here would simply flee in the midst of the bombardment, as they had in past battles. But the troops that were stationed here did not run away. Now, this bombardment was supposed to last for 20 minutes. It ends up lasting for over an hour and a half. That's a lot of shells that are exploding in this area.